You've probably noticed that a lot of core directives in Blade have a corresponding ending tag. For example, if you have an if tag, you probably have a corresponding end if. Same for each, you probably have an end for each. But those are pretty simple because they just use PHP's built-in templating syntax and don't really need to do anything with the contents between those two directives. But when you have something a little bit more complex, like say a section and end section, or maybe a component and an ending component tag, then they do extra things with the code you put between those tags. To take a look at how we can do that with our own directives, we're going to write a new one that'll let us compile the contents of it as Markdown. If you didn't know, Laravel's mail component actually comes with a Markdown class that lets us pass Markdown and return HTML from it. So for simplicity, we can just make use of this in our own directive. But what do we want to pass to the Markdown function? You might think we want to pass through the expression that comes through as an argument of the Markdown function, but that's not really the contents between the Markdown and ending Markdown function itself. Really, we want to do the echoing of the contents in the end directive because that'll be after everything inside it has been set up. But it's not going to be the expression that's passed to the end Markdown directive either. So how do we get the contents between these two tags? Oh, you might have already guessed it, but output buffers is a pretty good way to go. In the starting tag, we can start a new output buffer level. Then in the ending tag, we can close the buffer and get the contents, and put them into the Markdown parser in the process. Let's give it a shot. And if we refresh the page, we can see it works. And more so than that, anything that we do outside of the Markdown and end Markdown directives won't be converted to Markdown. We can just verify that it's converted into normal HTML, and it looks exactly as we expect in the source code of the page. So it's nice and simple, right? Now let's just make our directive a little bit more useful by also accepting a single line of Markdown as an argument. Right now, as you could expect, it's not going to display anything because we don't have an end Markdown tag. So back in the opening tag, we're first going to accept the expression, which is the list of arguments that we get through as a string. And we're going to use the handy strip parentheses function on the Blade compiler to remove any parentheses around it. Now we can check if there was actually an expression passed as arguments to the opening tag by just checking if it's got one or more characters in it. And if that is the case, we don't necessarily have an ending directive, so we don't want to start a new output buffer. So we can do the same logic that the end Markdown tag would do by echoing the past contents of the Markdown, but instead of passing it the contents of the output buffer, we can just pass it the expression itself. And now we can see it's worked, and it's actually passed our Markdown to a regular h1 tag in the HTML. So now we can also call our directive as a single line without an ending directive, which might be really useful if we want to pass it a variable instead of typing out the Markdown in line. So that's how you can get the contents between the start and the end of two directives, and it's all just the magic of output buffers.